The B-52 first took to the sky on April 1952, when Harry S Truman was president. It was built for one terrifying mission: carry nuclear weapons across the ocean and strike deep inside the Soviet Union. Engineers expected the bomber to last about 20 years. Instead, it outlived every aircraft meant to replace it. Now the U.S. Air Force is pouring nearly $50 billion into keeping these giants flying until 2060. That means bombers built in 1962 could approach 100 years old and still be combat ready. How is that even possible? The bomber that wouldn't retire. Right after the Second World War, the U.S. Air Force wanted a new heavy bomber that could fly from North America, cross the ocean, and hit targets deep inside the Soviet Union without stopping. Boeing won the contract in the mid-1940s, and the design went through several changes before the final shape we know today appeared. Long swept wings, 8 jet engines in 4 pods, and a thin, tube-like fuselage. The first prototype B-52 flew in April 1952, and the bomber officially entered Air Force service in February 1955. Over the next decade, Boeing built a whole family of versions, but the one that survived is the B-52H. The last one rolled off the line in October 1962. In total, 744 B-52s were built. Today, only a fraction of those early Cold War giants are still flying. As of recent U.S. Air Force figures, there are a little under 80 B-52s left in the active and reserve force combined, and all of them are B-52H models. Almost all of those jets live in 2 main homes. One is Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where the 2nd Bomb Wing and a reserve wing operate the bomber. The other is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, where the 5th Bomb Wing flies the same aircraft. All of them now fall under Air Force Global Strike Command. If you stand on the ramp at either base when a full lineup is parked outside, you do not see sleek stealth shapes. You see a row of long, gray, weather-stained giants with wings that seem to stretch forever and landing gear that looks like it came off a railroad car. Some of these airframes have outlived the pilots who first flew them and the crew chiefs who first cared for them. When it first joined the Strategic Air Command, the B-52's main job was simple and terrifying: stay on alert with nuclear weapons and be ready to fly toward the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. For years, some of these bombers sat loaded on the ground while others flew long patrols near the edges of Soviet airspace, so that a nuclear strike could be launched even if bases on the ground were hit. But the B-52's story did not stop with nuclear standoffs. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the B-52 became a constant presence over Southeast Asia. Under the Arc Light program, the bomber dropped huge loads of conventional bombs on Viet Cong bases and North Vietnamese supply routes. Crews often flew long, straight runs at high altitude while hundreds of bombs fell in tight patterns on the jungle below. In December 1972, during Operation Linebacker II, waves of B-52s hit targets around Hanoi and Haiphong in one of the largest heavy bomber campaigns since the Second World War. Those raids were costly and dangerous, but they showed how much punishment the aircraft could both deliver and survive. By the time of the Gulf War in early 1991, the B-52 had changed again. Instead of only dropping simple iron bombs, it carried more refined weapons and flew some of the opening missions of Operation Desert Storm. According to the Air Force, B-52s delivered about 40% of all the weapons dropped by coalition aircraft during that war. Some of those missions launched from remote bases such as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Others involved marathon flights. In 1996, during Operation Desert Strike, 2 B-52s flew a round-trip mission of about 16,000 miles from Barksdale to strike targets in Iraq and then come home. That flight lasted about 34 hours. Very few aircraft in history have done anything like that. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the B-52 found yet another role. Over Afghanistan, it did not just drop huge spreads of bombs. It used satellite-guided weapons that could hit single buildings or even individual sections of a mountain ridge. Air Force histories describe the bomber orbiting high above the battlefield while small teams of troops on the ground called in precise strikes. For soldiers pinned down in remote valleys, the deep rumble of 8 engines overhead meant they were no longer alone. The same story repeated over Iraq in 2003. At the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom, B-52s launched around 100 conventional air-launched cruise missiles in a single night to hit high-value targets with great accuracy. In a few decades, a bomber that once relied on sheer volume of bombs had turned into a sniper that could put guided weapons on individual aim points while still carrying more ordnance than almost anything else in the sky. Even that was not the end of its combat list. In 2016, the B-52 returned to the Middle East for the fight against ISIS. The Air Force reports that the bomber flew about 1,800 combat sorties against ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria, helping to break the group's control of key cities. Over 2 years, B-52 squadrons dropped nearly 12,000 weapons on ISIS and Taliban targets across the region. In many cases, the aircraft stayed overhead for hours, ready to strike if ground forces called for help. Inside the community, hardly anyone calls it Stratofortress. The usual name is the Buff, short for Big Ugly Fat Fellow. It does not cut through the air like a sleek fighter or disappear on radar like a stealth jet. It looks like a flying truck with wings, gear doors, pods, and antennas stuck everywhere. But that is the whole point. It is a huge, stable platform that hauls an absurd amount of bombs and missiles and keeps them in the air for a very long time. On paper, each B-52 can carry about 70,000 pounds of mixed weapons, both inside its bomb bay and on pylons under the wings. It can be loaded with traditional gravity bombs, cluster munitions, sea mines, standoff cruise missiles, and many kinds of precision-guided weapons. Its unrefueled combat range is listed at more than 8,800 miles, and aerial refueling can stretch that to the point where the only real limit is how long the crew can stay awake. For mission planners, that mix of payload and reach is gold. Then there is the money side, which may sound dry but actually explains a lot about why this bomber would not retire. Older figures from Air Force cost studies and outside reviews show that a B-52 costs on the order of $70,000 per hour to operate, while a stealth B-2 can be more than twice that, with some estimates putting the B-2's flight cost between $150,000 and $200,000 per hour. When you need to fly bomber missions day after day, year after year, those extra tens of thousands of dollars every single hour add up fast. The B-52 may be big and ugly, but it gives a lot of punch for each dollar spent. Over the years, 3 different bombers were supposed to push it aside. First came the B-1B Lancer, built to sprint at very high speed and low altitude to dodge Soviet radar. Then came the B-2 Spirit, the flying wing stealth bomber designed to slip through the thickest air defenses on Earth. Now the B-21 Raider is entering the picture as the next stealth bomber, with the U.S. Air Force planning for at least 100 of them. On paper, that looks like a clear line of succession. In reality, none of those successors actually killed the Buff. The B-1 fleet has been pushed hard for years, and at times it has even been grounded while inspectors dealt with safety problems. Some of those issues involved the ejection system and other key hardware that had to be repaired or replaced. The B-2 force is tiny, with fewer than 20 aircraft in service, and each one costs enormous sums to buy and to keep airworthy. The B-21 is still working through test and early production, and it is meant for the scariest missions where stealth is absolutely needed and risk is highest. That leaves the B-52 in a unique spot. It is not the fastest, it is not invisible to radar, but it is cheap enough to use often, tough enough to keep flying year after year, and flexible enough to carry almost any weapon the planners want to hang on it. As one aviation writer put it, superior performance at high subsonic speed combined with relatively low operating cost is exactly what has kept the bomber in service despite newer designs. Under all of that history and love, though, a quiet crisis has been building. Every B-52H relies on 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33 jet engines. These engines were designed in the early 1960s and have been hanging under the wings for generations. Pratt & Whitney stopped building new TF-33 engines long ago. As the years rolled by, more and more supporting parts went out of production too. Maintainers at bases like Barksdale and Minot have learned to keep these old engines going with a mix of skill and creativity. But in recent years, that creativity has had to stretch further than anyone is comfortable with. A detailed report in early 2024 described how the TF-33 is now the single part most likely to be cannibalized on the B-52. Cannibalization is the blunt name for pulling working parts off one aircraft to keep another one flying. In some cases, whole engines have been taken from jets that are headed into heavy maintenance so that another bomber can make a mission. A separate article on a Department of Defense review in late 2023 said that poor tracking of spare parts, aging supplier lists, and gaps in planning have all made the situation worse. Some of the companies that once made key components for the B-52 simply do not exist anymore. The result is more time with jets sitting on the ground waiting for parts, and more pressure on maintainers to shuffle hardware around just to keep enough aircraft ready to meet daily demands. For a long time, this hidden struggle was just part of life around the Buff. The bomber kept flying combat missions, training sorties, and long theater patrols, while crews and mechanics quietly paid the price in long hours and clever workarounds. But engines that date back to the Kennedy era can only be stretched so far. Even the Air Force and the engine maker have said that support for the TF-33 cannot go on forever. That is the point where this old bomber finally hit a wall. The Air Force could either start planning the funeral and let the B-52 fade into museums and scrap yards, or it could try something much bolder. Rip into a 60-year-old airframe, solve the engine and parts crisis in one move, and give the Buff an entirely new lease on life. Instead of walking away, the service chose the risky option. The next part of the story is what happens when you decide to tear out the heart of a Cold War bomber and build it a new one so it can keep flying toward 2060. The insane upgrade saving the B-52. In late 2021, the Air Force awarded Rolls-Royce a contract worth up to about $2.6 billion to build the F-130 engine for the B-52 fleet. The F-130 is not some strange one-off design. It is part of the BR-700 family that already powers Gulfstream G650 business jets and several military aircraft, like the E-11 communications relay jet and the C-37 transport. In short, they chose an engine that is already flying all over the world, then adapted it for the bomber. Those new engines change almost everything about how the jet behaves in the air and on the ramp. Air Force planners have talked about a goal of roughly 20 to 30% better fuel efficiency and a big jump in range and time on station once the new engines are fully in use. That means the bomber can either go farther without tankers or stay above a target area longer before it has to turn home. The F-130 is also designed to stay on the aircraft much longer between major overhauls. It needs fewer scheduled removals, and it has modern built-in systems that constantly monitor the engine's health. That translates into more missions and fewer days stuck in a hangar waiting for parts. There was one thing the engineers did not touch: the basic 8-engine layout. In the past, design teams looked at ripping off the twin pods and putting 4 larger engines under the wings instead. On paper, that might look simpler. In reality, it raised messy problems with clearances, thrust balance if one engine failed, and loads on the wing that the original design never planned for. So the Air Force kept the familiar setup of 2 engines on each of the 4 pylons, but gave each spot a modern, more powerful, more efficient engine. The bomber still looks like a B-52 at first glance, but the breath coming out of it is very different. For crews, the change shows up in everyday life. Those old TF-33 engines leave a thick, dark trail behind the jet and often act like a temperamental group of 8, each with its own set of quirks. The F-130 is quieter and burns cleaner. Getting from contract to a full fleet of re-engined bombers is a long, careful process. Rolls-Royce has been running F-130s on test stands for years and finished critical design review in late 2024. Then the company moved to more extreme trials at Arnold Engineering Development Complex in Tennessee, where the engines are run in special chambers that can mimic thin air at high altitude, crosswinds, and emergency cases like losing one or more engines. At the same time, Boeing, as the main integrator, is designing new nacelles, pylons, and all the plumbing and wiring needed to bolt the engines to a 1950s airframe. The first B-52 test aircraft with F-130s is planned to fly later in the decade. Government watchdogs now say that the combined upgrade package that turns the bomber into the B-52J is not expected to reach initial combat use until around the year 2033, roughly 3 years later than first planned. If the engines are the new heart, the radar in the front of the jet is the new set of eyes. The current mechanical radar in the B-52 dates back decades and sweeps back and forth like a lighthouse beam. The new system from Raytheon is an active electronically scanned array, often called an AESA. Instead of one big dish moving around, it uses thousands of tiny transmit and receive modules that steer the beam electronically. That means it can look at the ground, track moving targets, and watch the sky all at the same time without any heavy parts swinging back and forth. It is based on the same family as the AN/APG-79 radar used in modern Navy fighters, but scaled and tuned for the bomber. Raytheon delivered the first ESA radar shipset for the B-52 to Boeing in 2023 for use in lab work and fit checks. In December of 2025, Boeing handed over the first B-52 with the new radar installed to the Air Force, and the jet ferried from San Antonio to Edwards Air Force Base in California for a long series of ground and flight tests. For the crew, the new radar is about finally having a sensor that can pick out ships, vehicles, and terrain in bad weather, at night, and over long distances with far more detail. Reports from the test community say the bomber will be able to track moving targets on the ground, create very sharp maps of coastlines and cities, and help guide the smart weapons it already carries to their targets. Behind that nose, the cockpit is also changing. The current layout dates back to the age of steam gauges, when each system had its own needle and dial. Over the last decade, the Air Force has been rolling in the Combat Network Communications Technology package, often called Connect, which brought in new computers, color displays for moving maps, and digital radios. The new round of upgrades builds on that spine and goes further, swapping many of the old instruments for glass screens that can show engine data, radar feeds, threat warnings, and weapon status on a handful of big, easy-to-read panels. The communication side is getting a serious lift as well. With Connect and follow-on work, the bomber can use modern radios like the ARC-210 to send and receive voice and data across long distances, and it is being wired to use Link 16 and other data links. In the past, crews often had to copy new target coordinates by hand from scratchy voice calls, then quickly enter them into the weapon systems while under pressure. With the new digital backbone, updated maps, threat reports, and new target points can arrive as data and appear directly on the crew's displays. It turns a bomber that once had to rely on outdated information into one that can stay connected to the latest situation as it flies. This network link is a quiet but important part of the upgrade. The Air Force likes to talk about a future where jets, ships, satellites, and ground units all share one common picture, sometimes using the label Joint All-Domain Command and Control. For the B-52J, that big idea shows up in simple ways. Being able to pass targeting data to and from other aircraft, seeing where friendly fighters and ships are without asking on the radio, and letting distant command centers retask the bomber in real time if a higher priority target appears. Under the belly, the weapons bay is getting smarter too. For many years, the bomber had to hang most of its guided weapons outside on the wings, even though it has a large bomb bay inside the fuselage. The problem was that the wiring and launcher inside were built for simple freefall bombs and nuclear stores, not smart weapons that talk to the jet. The solution is something called the MIL-STD 1760 Internal Weapons Bay Upgrade. In simple terms, it's a new digital launcher and wiring system that lets the B-52 carry modern smart weapons inside its weapons bay, with the proper power and data connections needed to operate them. With that kit installed, the bomber can load 8 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munition bombs inside the bay. It can also carry long-range AGM-158 JASSM and JASSM-ER cruise missiles internally, as well as ADM-160 MALD and MALD-J decoy missiles that mimic other aircraft on radar. 2 upgraded B-52s can carry more smart weapons than 3 older jets because the internal bay is now doing real work instead of just hauling empty space. Carrying more weapons inside also cuts drag, which means more fuel saved and more range without changing the wings. The hard points under the wings are not being ignored. The Air Force is working on new, much stronger pylons for the B-52 so that each station can carry heavier and more complex weapons. Reports have described plans for pylons that can handle very large conventional bombs and multiple hypersonic cruise missiles on each wing. The bomber has already been used as the main test platform for the AGM-183A air-launched rapid response weapon. Even though that program has faced cuts and restarts, the basic idea has stayed the same, using the B-52 as a flying truck for hypersonic weapons. New missiles like the Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile are expected to ride on those underwing stations in the future, turning each jet into a launcher for long-range, very fast weapons. On top of that conventional punch, there is also a new nuclear arm coming. The AGM-181 long-range standoff missile, now in development, is meant to replace the aging AGM-86B nuclear cruise missile. The B-52 is expected to be one of the main carriers. The keyword here is standoff. Instead of having to fly near dense air defense zones, the bomber will be able to launch from far outside and let the missile fly the rest of the way. All of this only works because the bones of the airframe can take one more round of upgrades. When Boeing designed the B-52 in the early Cold War, engineers did not have the kind of detailed computer modeling used today. To be safe, they built in extra strength. Over the years, inspections at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma have shown that this conservative approach left a lot of structural margin. Every few years, each jet goes to the depot there, where workers strip it down, check the wings, fuselage, and key joints for cracks and corrosion, fix what they find, and then send the bomber back out with fresh life in the structure. The current modernization wave layers on top of that steady depot rhythm. Individual aircraft are pulled from their home wings at places like Barksdale and Minot and flown to modification centers. Boeing and Air Force teams then open up the jet, run new wiring and plumbing, reinforce and reshape the engine pylons, install the F-130 engines, fit the ASA radar up front, and tie in cockpit and weapons bay changes. After ground tests and check flights, the bomber returns to its unit, now one step closer to the full B-52J standard. Too many jets in the shop at once, and day-to-day missions suffer. Too few, and the fleet takes longer to reach the new configuration. Balancing that flow is its own kind of engineering problem. The future role of the B-52 bomber. When the upgrades are done and the jet rolls out of the hangar, the first people who really have to care are not the engineers. It is the planners in windowless rooms with big maps on the wall. They are the ones who write the options for what happens when a crisis blows up at 3 in the morning. For them, the real question is simple. Now that this old bomber has a new life, where does it sit on the war plan for the 2040s and 2050s? Inside places like the Pentagon and the big regional commands, they like to talk about options. If there is trouble in one part of the world, what tools can you send? How fast and with what message? The upgraded B-52J shows up on more than one line of that menu. It can be a visible show of force, a long-range strike platform, a nuclear signal, or a quiet backup in case other plans fail. Very few aircraft tick that many boxes at the same time, which is why planners keep it in the mix even as newer stealth bombers arrive. You can see how this plays out first in the Pacific. That region is full of long stretches of ocean and tight flashpoints around places like Taiwan, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. China and Russia now fly their own bomber patrols in those waters, sometimes together, to show off their reach and to test how Japan and the United States react. When Washington wants to answer without firing a shot, one of the easiest moves is to send a pair of B-52s out over the sea to fly with Allied fighters. That has already happened in recent drills, with U.S. bombers flying alongside Japanese jets after sharp Chinese statements about Taiwan and other disputes. In those kinds of days, the bomber does not need to cross any lines or push into thick air defenses. It can cruise high and far from shore, escorted by local fighters, while everyone in the region watches the radar tracks and the social media clips. The message is very basic. There is a heavy U.S. strike platform in theater, and it can stay there as long as it needs to. The upgraded engines and systems just make that easier to do more often and for longer stretches, so planners can keep it on the board as a steady option instead of a rare one-off gesture. The same pattern shows up over Europe and the Arctic. In recent years, B-52s have rotated through Royal Air Force Fairford in the United Kingdom for bomber task force deployments. From there, they have flown training routes over places like the Baltic and the Black Sea, sometimes with Allied fighters from several nations in formation. Before Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, 4 bombers from Minot Air Force Base arrived in Britain as part of the buildup. Analysts later pointed out that of all the U.S. tools, the B-52 was chosen because it is a very clear, very public symbol that can be moved quickly and seen by friend and foe alike. For Allied leaders, that visibility is the whole point. When a B-52 lands at a base in the United Kingdom, Poland, or somewhere in the Pacific, it gives local governments something concrete to point to. They can tell their voters, "We are not standing here alone." For U.S. planners, that same flight checks several boxes at once. It trains crews, it tests routes, it shows commitment to allies, and it quietly reminds rivals that long-range strike options are already in place if talks go bad. Where the bomber really earns its place on future war maps, though, is in how it helps control how fast a crisis climbs. Think of escalation as a set of steps. On the lower steps, you send ships, fighters, and unarmed or lightly armed bombers into a region just to be seen. That is where the B-52J can fly with training loads or simple dummy weapons and still send a loud message, because everyone knows what it could carry if things get worse. A step higher, you load it with real conventional weapons and keep it on call just outside the danger zone. Only at the top do you start talking about nuclear options. The key is that the same aircraft can play at several steps on that ladder without you having to bring in a completely different kind of force. That is where its nuclear role matters. The United States keeps nuclear forces on 3 legs: land-based missiles in silos, missiles on submarines under the ocean, and long-range bombers that can carry nuclear bombs or cruise missiles. The B-52 has been part of that air leg for decades and is expected to stay there with modern standoff missiles that can be fired from far away. In a high-tension situation, bombers have one special trait that missiles do not. They can be launched, flown toward a region with weapons on board, and then called back if cooler heads prevail. You cannot call back a ballistic missile once it leaves the silo or the submarine. All of this is happening while rivals are running their own bomber games. Russian Tu-95 Bear bombers and Chinese H-6 bombers keep probing air defense zones and flying joint patrols to send their own signals. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.